Now, family members, I want you to listen very, very closely to me, because history doesn't sometime, it always repeats itself. And I'm going to give you some information that, unless you are a devout student of economic history, you probably don't know what I'm about to tell you, but it has a precedence, it has an imprint, it has an effect on what is happening even today with the U.S. economy. I'm going to speak to you about the Forgotten Depression. The Forgotten Depression that occurred during 1920 to 1921. Now, during the year 1920, economic calamity strikes these United States of America. And the government did absolutely nothing. Was it really FDR, talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who saved capitalism from itself? Well, let's go over what actually did happen before FDR took office and before the actual Great Depression hit these United States. Yes, there was another depression that occurred between 1920 and 1921. So I'm going to take you back to the year 1921. And during that particular time, America is less than 3 years removed from triumph on the Western Front. It's the dawn of what was known as and is known as the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age. Our president was Warren Harding, and the nation is sunk in depression. U.S. industrial production plunged 31% between 1920 and 1921, and stock prices plummeted 46%, and corporate profits fell a crushing 92%. Unemployment during this time ran as high as 19%. I said 19%. Storefronts everywhere were empty. It was the grand migraine of the day. Then suddenly, it was all over. That's right, the Depression lasted less than 18 months, less than 2 years. I'm talking about from 1920 to 1921. The pain was indeed acute, but the pain was brief. By 1922, prosperity was finding its legs again in these United States of America. I'd like to now welcome you to the Forgotten Depression of 1920 to 1921. So how, pray tell, did America avoid depression in the early 1920s? Okay, well, that is a story that is very, very seldom told. But had it been otherwise, the Forgotten Depression may have been known as the Great Depression, okay? But why wasn't it? Well, the economic physicians of the day mostly let the ailing patient, also known as the U.S. economy, they left it alone. Despite the progressive eras encroaching the World War I situation, okay, what ended up happening was the U.S. government did nothing at all. In the America of 1921, the stock market looked at itself and buried its own head. Business was on its own hook. Businesses had to fend for themselves. They weren't waiting for a government bailout. And at that particular time, you got to remember, the Federal Reserve was only 8 years old. Its role, talking about the Federal Reserve at the time, was simple, and it knew its role. And that was to provide liquidity to the banking system in the event of another banking crisis. That was it. No more, no less. That's inconceivable as it relates to today's Federal Reserve. You see, the Fed back then sat back as the economic machinery seized up heading into the 1921 time frame. In the words of one economic historian, and I quote, "Despite the severity of the contraction, the Fed did not move to use its powers to turn the money supply around and fight the contraction," end quote. Believe it or not, and you might not believe it, they actually increased rates. Listen to me. The United States was going into a depression, year 1920, 1921. And the Fed did what? They didn't decrease interest rates like the Federal Reserve did here during our last recession. The Fed actually increased interest rates. Let me explain this to you. Yeah, I've got your interest now. I perked your interest. Yep. You see, the Fed raised rates from 4% in 1919 to 7% in 1920. And then they raised them again to 6% in 1921, right in the middle of that particular depression. Now you say to yourself, what? Raising interest rates in a depression? Didn't they know? Well, not until 1922, after the recovery was well along, did they reduce rates to 4% again. Now you might say that's absolutely remarkable. Trust but verify. Verify everything that I'm telling you. Go back and Google it and research it yourself. And once depression broke upon the scene, President Harding broke every one of today's commandments. Did he try to spin the country into recovery? Did he raise taxes on the rich? The answer is no and no. You see, Harding nearly solved the federal budget in half between 1920 and 1922. He shriveled the national debt by a third. He slashed taxes A through Z. Okay? But Harding followed a different set of rules, a different set of lights, if you will. Imagine, if possible, a contemporary president pounding this particular drum. We will attempt intelligent and courageous deflation and strike at government borrowing, which enlarges the evil. And we will attack high-cost government with every energy and facility which attend Republican capacity. Let us call to all the people for thrift and economy, for denial and sacrifice if need be, for a nationwide drive against extravagance and luxury, to a recommittal to simplicity of living, to that prudent and normal plan of life which is the health of the republic. Those are the words of President Harding during that very, very brief depression. You see, Harding prescribed a medicine too bitter for today's America. But it was the proper medicine in the proper dose at that particular time. Recovery was underway by the summer of 1921. Unemployment was down to 6.7% by the following year and a vanishing 2.4% the year after. Industry was on the jump once again. And it is noted that the economy rebounded quickly from the 1920 to 1921 depression and entered a period of quite vigorous growth. So, the budget was cut, the money supply was reduced, and interest rates rose. Yet, these policies proved so primitive and counterproductive, the country was out of a depression within 18 months. The facts are indeed the facts. But for his efforts, or lack of same, President Harding has been read out of history altogether. It was the Saint FDR who a decade later, quote, is known for saving capitalism from itself, end quote, with his New Deal and massive assault on enterprise. Isn't it ironic that, but history smiles upon men of action, even if it's the wrong action. You see, inaction makes for dull history and idle historians. But if Harding had been a man of action, like FDR was, the 1920s might have been known as the Great Depression and not the 1929, 1930 plus era. And the term Roaring Twenties would probably be as unknown today as President Harding is in and of himself. You see, family members, economies, they morph, which is a form of change. But the basic concept of capitalism keeps them in the same arena. What we are doing now, what the Fed, I should say, is doing now is the exact opposite of what President Warren Harding did. That was actually in the midst of a depression, not a recession, a depression, and it brought the United States from the economic calamity in less than 8 18 months. Family members, as I've said to you many, many times, this market is rising on unfounded exuberance. The frothy nature of the markets cannot sustain themselves. You must be prepared to get P.A.I.D. no matter what happens with the market. And the market will indeed deflate. I gave you during our last radio broadcast 107 years of evidence that the time for the market to move to the downside demonstrably is within the next 18 months. Go back, listen to the radio broadcast. It's on our website on demand at www.askthewiz.info. That's www.asktthewiz.info. Listen and write down all of the empirical evidence that I should submit to you to validate that the U.S. economy must go through a recession, and it's going to be a terrible one within the next 18 months. And then go back and research the information that I submit to you to validate my hypothesis, okay? To give you substantial evidence pertaining to the underlying concept of my hypothesis. And you will see that your portfolio must be adjusted now to absorb the inevitable. Now, one of the ways to adjust your portfolio is to get P.A.I.D. from real estate, but you must do it intelligently. And the intelligent way to invest in real estate these days in this market is buying through real estate investment trusts, commonly known as REITs.